King Charles III is officially ascending to the British throne to be the new monarch. And for the first time in history, we're able to watch the ceremony at home from start.
The sealed folder sat on the table between them, and King Edmund did not reach for it. Not yet. He looked instead at the faces around him, his son Alexander, his daughter-in-law Isabel, his wife Queen Eleanor, and his sister Princess Margarethe. No one spoke. In the hush, before a single word was said, everyone in that private council room understood that whatever waited inside that folder could not be unlearned once it was known. This was not a routine gathering. There had been no agenda circulated, no briefing given to the household staff, no warning of any kind. The summons had simply arrived that morning, 3 lines on palace stationery, asking each of them to appear in the small council chamber at noon. When a king calls his family together without explanation, the news is rarely small, and everyone in that room had learned, over years of service to the crown, to read the silence as clearly as they read the words that eventually broke it. King Edmund opened the folder, and by the time he closed it again, the future of his family had changed. Edmund did not ease them into it. He named the date plainly, the second Saturday of the following spring, at the old cathedral in the capital, Alexander's coronation. For a long moment nobody moved. Alexander, the crown prince, had spent his entire adult life preparing for a moment he'd always imagined as distant. Something that lived on the far side of another decade, not something with a date attached to it now, sitting on a piece of paper in his father's hand. He asked the only question that mattered. Why now? Edmund did not answer right away. He looked down at his own hands instead, and that pause, a monarch unable to meet his son's eyes, said more than any formal statement could have. The date had not been chosen out of convenience. It had been chosen because of something that had already happened, something Edmund was not yet ready to explain to the full room. Isabel felt the weight of it before Alexander had time to process his own feelings. Becoming queen consort was not simply a change of title for her. It meant a different life entirely, less privacy, a different rhythm to every ordinary day, and above all, a different childhood for her 2 children, who were still young enough to believe the world outside the palace gates was the whole world. She understood, sitting in that chamber, that no one else in the room could feel the particular fear she felt for them. Then came the second surprise. Edmund announced that the ceremonial design of the coronation, the music, the seating, the tributes, the shape of the day itself, would be placed under Isabel's direct oversight. Not Alexander's, not Eleanor's, Isabel's. The air in the room changed. Everyone understood what the decision meant, and not everyone was prepared to accept it. Eleanor's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. She had spent years earning her place beside this king, weathering a public that had not always been kind to her, and she had assumed reasonably that her voice would matter in decisions like this one. She opened her mouth to object. Before she could, Edmund closed the folder. The gesture was small, but it was final, and her objection died unspoken. Princess Margarethe, who had spent decades learning to read the currents beneath royal calm, understood immediately that this would not stay buried. It would surface again somewhere else, in a room with fewer witnesses. Alexander finally rested one hand on the folder's cover, but did not open it further. Isabel placed her fingers lightly over his wrist. No words, just that. Edmund watched them with an expression that mixed pride and something heavier, something that, to those paying close attention, looked almost like grief. It was Margarethe who noticed the second envelope. Tucked beneath Edmund's chair, half hidden, clearly placed there on purpose. It bore Alexander's initials and 4 words beneath them. To be opened privately. The date had been announced, but the larger revelation was still sealed, and the king had not been ready to open it in front of his family. Alexander did not open the envelope in the council chamber. He carried it out with him, unopened, through a week of briefings and rehearsals that suddenly felt different, no longer distant training for a future role, but immediate preparation for a fixed date now written down and impossible to unwrite. Isabel found him in a quiet corridor that evening. She did not speak to him as a future queen, but as his wife, and as the only person in the building who could tell him the truth without ceremony. She told him that their children would sense his fear long before any courtier noticed it. Children read their parents with an accuracy no adult training can match. And if dread took root in him now, it would take root in them too, long before they were old enough to understand what the crown actually meant. He held the envelope a while longer before he finally broke the seal. Inside was a single handwritten line. This date became necessary after what happened at Amberfield. Months earlier, before any coronation date had been fixed, Edmund had arranged a quiet continuity exercise at Amberfield, the family's countryside estate. Officially, it was framed as a rehearsal, a way to test how the senior family would respond if the monarch were suddenly unable to fulfill a major duty. Nothing more than a precaution, or so Alexander had believed at the time. Isabel had understood something more unsettling. Edmund was not merely observing a procedural drill. He was studying discipline, composure, and the shape of loyalty under sudden pressure, an audition, in effect, for what the monarchy would look like once he was no longer at its center, and every person in that room had been performing without knowing the real stakes. The exercise unfolded as scripted: a fictional crisis, canceled engagements, delayed constitutional paperwork. Then a senior official posed a question that broke the drill wide open. If the king could no longer carry out his duties, who would lead? Eleanor answered before Alexander had the chance. She declared that no transition should proceed without her explicit approval. The room went still. Edmund did not react with anger, only disbelief. He had prepared for hesitation, for resistance, even for grief. He had not prepared for a direct claim on the machinery of succession itself. Alexander stayed quiet, out of respect for his father's wife, and out of a genuine sense that this was not the moment to contest anything. Isabel saw immediately what that silence would cost him. Restraint in a moment like that reads as uncertainty, and uncertainty around succession is not a small problem. It is an open door for exactly the kind of rivalry that can quietly fracture an institution from the inside. After the exercise ended, Edmund confronted his son privately and asked why he hadn't spoken up. Alexander's answer was simple. He would not fight Eleanor for authority while his father was still the one holding it. It was a loyal answer. It also exposed exactly the kind of structural gap that appears whenever succession is left undefined. Isabel arrived moments later and said what needed saying. She told Edmund that Alexander's silence had been respect, not weakness. But she warned him, gently and without softening the substance of it, that delaying a clear transition plan would only give other people time to build influence around Alexander before he had the tools to hold his own ground. Edmund removed the signet ring he wore, the personal seal of his office, and set it on the table between them. One day, silence will no longer protect you, he told his son. That same night, he instructed his private secretary to draft a fixed coronation timetable. And in the same document, he named Isabel head of the Ceremonial Planning Council. The exercise at Amberfield had exposed a fracture. Edmund's response was to do the one thing no one expected so soon. He began building his son's future before anyone else could shape it first. Eleanor was not finished. Once she learned how directly the events at Amberfield had shaped the coronation date, she requested a private meeting with Isabel, a conversation that history, in this telling, has consistently underestimated. There were no advisors present, no secretaries, no husbands in the room. Just two women, bound to the same institution, divided over what its future should look like. The meeting took place at Eleanor's own residence, a deliberate choice of ground. She had expected Isabel to arrive with documents, perhaps a representative, some kind of formal buffer. Instead, Isabel came alone and empty-handed. The message was clear before either of them said a word. She intended to speak as a future queen, not hide behind procedure. Eleanor opened with an accusation that the new ceremonial plans were allowing Edmund to erase his own reign before it had even properly ended, that every stripped-away tradition chipped at the dignity of the crown he still wore. Isabel did not retreat. Preparing Alexander, she said, was not an attack on the king. It was protection against exactly the kind of confusion that Amberfield had already exposed to the whole household. The conversation sharpened. Eleanor spoke of years of public scrutiny, of isolation, of an institution that had treated her as an obstacle before it ever accepted her, and argued that endurance had earned her a voice in shaping what came next. Isabel listened fully before she answered. Survival, she said finally, could not become the institution's guiding purpose. Eleanor then made two direct requests: prominent seating for her own family at the ceremony, and a formal role within the service itself. Isabel declined both, calmly and without cruelty, explaining that the coronation would center on the lawful passage of duty from father to son, not on distributing private recognitions. Then she showed Eleanor something unexpected: a signed planning instruction, written by Edmund himself after the Amberfield exercise, ordering the removal of a disputed ceremonial segment. It was not Isabel's ambition being imposed. It was the king's own decision in his own hand. Eleanor could no longer frame it as a young woman's overreach. She asked, before leaving, whether Isabel intended to become queen before the crown had even touched her. Isabel paused at the door and answered simply, "No. I intend to be ready when it does." Eleanor went straight to Edmund afterward and asked him to reverse the decision. He was now caught between two loyalties: protecting his wife from a public sense of diminishment, and protecting his son's transition from being pulled apart by competing influence. He could not fully do both. It is worth pausing on what this choice actually cost him. Edmund had waited his whole life for the crown he now held. He was not being pushed toward this decision by illness or crisis. He made it freely, and understanding why he made it explains everything that follows. Margarethe found him afterward, sitting beside and in signed order, and told him plainly what hesitation would cost. Every unclear instruction created new pockets of rival influence around Alexander, and without firm boundaries, relatives and advisors alike would begin competing for proximity to the future king. The plan existed to prevent exactly that. Leaving it vague would guarantee it. Edmund signed the document. It confirmed that Isabel's ceremonial decisions could only be overruled by Alexander or by Edmund himself, not by Eleanor, not by any advisor, not by any relative. Eleanor read the first line, closed the folder, and withdrew her hand from his without a word. He did not try to stop her. The silence between them carried the full weight of what had just happened. Within days, the machinery of transition began quietly moving. Meetings once led by Edmund started appearing under Alexander's name. Long-serving staff were gently reassigned. Power was shifting before any public announcement had been made. For Edmund, every transferred duty felt like a small piece of his own identity being set down. For Alexander, every new responsibility carried the unspoken weight of his father's approaching absence. He noticed more than once staff beginning to treat his father as though he had already stepped aside, and each time he corrected it. Edmund remained the reigning monarch until the very last moment, and Alexander made sure no rearranged chair or reordered meeting would suggest otherwise. There was one afternoon that stopped him cold, arriving at a routine briefing to find his father's usual seat shifted slightly aside, his own moved to the center of the table. No one had announced it. No one had intended offense. It had simply happened, as if it had always been that way. Alexander saw his father's face before anyone could explain, and without a word, he moved the chair back beside his own. "I will not begin by pushing you away," he said. Edmund sat down beside him, and for one quiet moment, the crown did not stand between them at all. That evening, Edmund asked Alexander to meet him alone, back at Amberfield, in the same room where they had once spoken after the death of Alexander's grandmother. The choice of room was not accidental. Edmund wanted his son to feel that shared history before hearing what came next. He told Alexander plainly that he had worried, for some time, about waiting too long. He had watched what uncertainty produced during the exercise months earlier, the competing claims, the dangerous confusion over who held the right to lead, and he had decided, that same night, that he would not let hesitation become his son's inheritance. The date was not arbitrary. It marked the anniversary of a private promise Edmund had made years before, that when the crown finally came, Alexander would not face it unprepared. Fixing the date was his way of keeping that promise before illness or crisis could take the choice out of his hands. Alexander, in turn, admitted what actually frightened him, not the crown itself, but the possibility that its weight might slowly create distance between himself and Isabel, and between himself and his children. Duty had already taken pieces of their private life. He could not accept a reign that asked for what remained. Edmund understood that fear completely. He had lived inside it his whole life. He told Alexander that Isabel had been placed at the center of the coronation precisely because she respected the institution's history without being trapped by it. Her role was not decorative, it was protective. She would help guard the people entering the next reign from being consumed by the machine around them. He took a small handwritten card from his pocket, the coronation oath he had once feared taking himself, and placed it in his son's hand. "Do not inherit my fear along with my crown," he said. Alexander accepted the card and set one condition of his own. His father would not walk into that cathedral as a man who had been pushed aside. He would enter as a king who had secured the succession with intention, on his own terms, rather than one forced into it by circumstance. Edmund agreed, and with that, whatever tension remained between them quietly resolved. When the announcement was finally made public, it did not simply add a line to the news cycle. It confirmed something the country had been quietly anticipating for years: the closing of one era and the careful, deliberate opening of another. Eleanor watched the first broadcast alone, listening as a commentator described Isabel as the architect of a ceremony built to carry old traditions into a new era. She lowered the volume but did not leave the room. Her silence held less anger than it did grief, the particular grief of watching a future take shape without her fully at its center. Isabel, for her part, was careful that the public response never curdled into something that looked like triumph over Edmund. She made sure the official statement noted that their eldest child would take a small ceremonial part in the service, linking 3 generations visibly together, while shielding their younger child from any pressure they weren't ready to carry. The statement also confirmed a quieter, more private plan. Before the cathedral doors opened to the public, Edmund, Alexander, and their eldest would stand together first. One reigning, one arriving, one still years from any of it, bound by more than duty alone. Outside the palace gates, a child in the crowd held up a hand-lettered sign that read simply, "Thank you. We're ready." The image spread quickly, and by morning it sat beside a headline that captured, more simply than any official statement could, what had actually happened. The crown was passing with a father's blessing. In the days before the ceremony, Isabel brought the completed ceremonial plan to a final family meeting. Every element of the service now settled, built to honor Edmund's reign, establish Alexander's authority, protect the children, and still preserve, within the limits Edmund had set, a defined place for Eleanor. Eleanor read it in full. She had believed, from the very beginning, that Isabel's authority was designed to push her out entirely. The finished plan told a different story. Her place was limited, clearly defined, but not erased. She offered no particular warmth, and no apology for anything said at Amberfield or in her own drawing room. But she agreed to support the ceremony without further resistance. It was enough. Alexander thanked his father for fixing the date before uncertainty could quietly divide the family further. Edmund answered that preparing his son properly would be the most important act of his reign. After decades spent waiting to receive the crown, his final achievement would be handing it over with order, dignity, and full intention.